We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Before anything else, subscribe right now because in this video we are answering the one question that has haunted this case.
Before anyone knew her name as part of a disappearance case, before investigators began walking through her home with gloves on, before law enforcement started studying cameras, timelines, doorways, blood evidence, phone records, family statements, and every small movement around her final known hours, Nancy Guthrie was simply a woman returning home at the end of a normal day. That is what makes this case so haunting. It did not begin in a dark alley. It did not begin with a loud public confrontation. It did not begin in a place where danger was expected. It began in the kind of setting where a person is supposed to feel most protected. A home, a driveway, a familiar door. The quiet rhythm of a life that had been repeated so many times that nothing about it should have felt dangerous. Nancy Guthrie had lived long enough to understand the world, to understand people, to understand trust, and to understand the routines that make life feel stable. She was elderly, vulnerable, and dependent in certain ways, but she was not invisible to the people who loved her. She had family, she had community, she had people who expected to see her. People who expected her to answer, people who knew that when Nancy did not appear where she was supposed to be, something was wrong. And yet, by the time anyone fully understood that something had happened, the most important hours were already gone. The night had already passed. The house had already gone quiet, and Nancy Guthrie had vanished. On January 31st, what should have been an ordinary evening became the beginning of a mystery that would pull her family, her neighborhood, local authorities, federal investigators, and the public into a case filled with silence, fear, and unanswered questions. According to the material you provided, the public narrative around Nancy's disappearance later became focused not only on the physical evidence, but also on alleged digital evidence, family knowledge, tension inside her circle, and statements reportedly made to investigators by someone close to her. But before any of that could matter, before any theory could be built, before anyone could talk about motive or opportunity or inner circle suspicion, there was only one terrible fact. Nancy was gone, and the circumstances did not feel normal. That is where the story has to begin. Because in cases like this, the first hours matter more than almost anything else. They are the hours when the truth is still closest to the surface. They are the hours before explanations are polished, before panic becomes strategy, before people have time to decide what they will say and what they will leave out. Those first hours hold the raw shape of what happened. They hold the original confusion, the original fear, the original evidence. The first version of the story before anyone has had time to reshape it. For Nancy Guthrie, those hours began with the simple act of coming home. There is something deeply unsettling about that image now. An elderly woman being brought back to her residence, likely believing the night was ending, likely expecting nothing more than the ordinary quiet of her own home. She had no reason, at least from the outside, to believe that this night would become the one people would later study minute by minute. She had no reason to know that her doorway, her security cameras, her routine, and her final known movements would become part of a criminal investigation. She had no reason to think that after this night, people would be asking who saw her, who knew she was home, who had access, who had motive, and who understood her vulnerabilities well enough to take advantage of them. That is the cruelty of disappearances like this. The victim is often the last person to know that danger has arrived. The people watching afterward can see the pattern forming. They can replay the timeline. They can freeze the last known moments and examine every detail. They can ask why something happened here and not somewhere else. They can ask why that hour, that door, that night. But the person at the center of it did not get to watch the story unfold from a distance. Nancy was living inside it. And then at some point the ordinary ended. There was a break in the routine. Something happened between the moment Nancy was last known to be safe and the moment the people around her realized she was missing. That space, that dark stretch of unknown time, became the heart of the investigation. It is the kind of silence that detectives spend months trying to break. It is not empty silence. It is full of hidden movement, full of decisions, full of details someone may have tried to erase, full of moments that seemed private at the time but later become evidence. Maybe a door opened. Maybe someone approached. Maybe Nancy recognized them. Maybe she did not. Maybe there was a conversation first. Maybe there was no time for one. Maybe the person who came to that house knew exactly what they were doing. Maybe they had been there before. Maybe they understood the cameras, the entrance, the routine, the layout, and the fact that Nancy was vulnerable. And maybe that is why, from the beginning, this case carried a fear that was difficult to say out loud. Because when an elderly woman disappears from her own home, and when her personal belongings remain behind, and when investigators begin treating the residence as more than just the last place she was seen, the question changes. It is no longer only where did she go, it becomes who came to her. That question is much more dangerous. It points outward, but it can also point inward. It forces investigators to think about strangers, but it also forces them to think about people who knew her, people who knew her habits, people who knew when she would be alone, people who knew whether she could defend herself, people who knew what doors she used, what cameras were present, and what kind of help she might need at the end of the day. A stranger can commit a terrible crime, that is always possible. But a stranger usually has to guess. A stranger has to take risks. A stranger has to learn quickly. Someone familiar with a victim does not have to guess in the same way. Familiarity can become a weapon. Trust can become a doorway. Knowledge can become cover. That does not mean the answer was obvious. It does not mean investigators could simply look at Nancy's family, friends, or acquaintances and know what happened. Real cases do not work that way. But it does mean that the investigation had to ask deeply uncomfortable questions. It had to look at who had been around Nancy, who had spoken to her, who had driven her, who had visited her, who had been inside the home, who had access to information, who had reason to know her movements, and who may have had reasons of their own to want something from her. In the first stage of a case like this, fear often spreads faster than facts. People want answers immediately. They want a name. They want an arrest. They want the story to make sense. But investigators cannot afford to move at the speed of public emotion. They have to move at the speed of evidence. They have to slow the night down. They have to take a period of time that passed in real life minute by minute and break it into fragments small enough to examine. Who called whom? Who was seen? Who was not seen? Which devices were active? Which devices were silent? Which cameras recorded? Which cameras failed? Which doors were used? Which items were left behind? Which statements were consistent? Which statements shifted? The public sees a disappearance. Investigators see a system of details. And somewhere inside those details is the answer. Nancy's absence was not just absence. It was evidence. When someone leaves willingly, they usually leave a trail that makes emotional and practical sense. They take things. They make arrangements. They communicate. They move in a way that matches intention. But when someone vanishes suddenly, without the items they need, without warning, without a reasonable explanation, and especially from a place where they should have been safe, the absence becomes something else. It becomes a sign of interruption. Nancy's life had been interrupted. That is the feeling that hangs over the beginning of this case. Not just that she was missing, but that something had cut across the normal path of her life and removed her from it. The next morning revealed the first true shape of the nightmare. Nancy did not appear where she was expected. That may sound like a small thing, but it was not. For people who live with routines, especially older people whose lives are connected to family, faith, caretaking, and scheduled activities, a missed appearance can be the first alarm. It is the world saying, something did not happen the way it always happens. Someone who should be here is not here. Someone who should answer is not answering. At first, people often search for harmless explanations. That is human nature. Nobody wants to believe the worst immediately. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she overslept. Maybe there was confusion about the plan. Maybe her phone was in another room. Maybe she was not feeling well. Maybe there was a simple reason. But simple reasons have a way of disappearing when the unanswered calls continue. Concern becomes urgency. Urgency becomes fear. Fear becomes action. And eventually, someone had to go to the house. That moment, the moment family or those close to Nancy realized she was not simply late or unreachable, but physically gone, is one of the most painful turning points in any disappearance case. It is the instant when worry becomes reality. The house is no longer just a place to check. It becomes the center of the unknown. Imagine approaching the home of someone you love, expecting to solve the concern quickly. Maybe you think you will find them resting. Maybe you think there has been a misunderstanding. Maybe you are already afraid, but you are still holding on to the idea that fear is premature. Then you arrive, and instead of answers, the house gives you more questions. Nancy was not there, and what remained behind did not make sense. That is when the emotional temperature of the case changed. Her belongings, her routine, her vulnerability, and the condition of the home all began to matter. Investigators would later have to determine exactly what each detail meant, but the broad picture was already alarming. Nancy had not simply gone about her day. She had not followed a normal pattern. She had not left in a way that felt consistent with ordinary movement. Something was wrong inside that house, or around it, or at the threshold between inside and outside. The doorway became important. The entrance became important. The last known movements became important. The people who had seen her the night before became important. And the hours between evening and morning became the most valuable piece of territory in the entire case. There is a reason investigators care so much about the place where a missing person was last known to be safe. It is the last confirmed point before the world becomes uncertain. From that point, every theory must travel forward. If Nancy was last known to be at or near her home, then whatever happened next had to connect to that location. Someone had to enter that space, lure her out of that space, force her from that space, or create circumstances that caused her to disappear from that space. Each possibility carries a different meaning. If she left willingly, why did she leave without what she needed? If she encountered a stranger, how did that stranger find the opportunity? If someone known to her was involved, how close were they? And what did they know? If the scene was altered, who had enough time and confidence to alter it? If cameras were interfered with, who understood where they were? If there was physical evidence near the entrance, what did it say about the struggle, the movement, and the direction in which Nancy was taken? These are not questions that can be answered with emotion. They require evidence, but emotion is always present because at the center of the evidence is a person, a mother, an elderly woman, someone who should have been protected, someone whose final known night became a map for investigators and a wound for her family. As the case moved forward, law enforcement did what law enforcement does in the early stages of a suspected abduction. They searched, they interviewed, they processed the scene, they asked the public for help, they looked for video, they looked for vehicles, they looked for anything unusual in the neighborhood. They tried to determine whether Nancy could still be alive, where she could have been taken, and who might have had contact with her. But the deeper work was quieter. The deeper work was not always visible from the outside. It was in the reconstruction of the timeline. It was in the comparison of statements. It was in the careful study of what did and did not happen at the home. It was in the small inconsistencies that might not matter alone but could become important when placed beside other facts. It was in the effort to separate grief from knowledge, confusion from deception, coincidence from pattern. That is one of the hardest parts of investigating a disappearance inside a family or close community. People are emotional. People remember imperfectly. People panic. People make mistakes. A person can give an inconsistent statement because they are lying, but they can also give an inconsistent statement because they are traumatized, exhausted, afraid, or trying to make sense of something that makes no sense. Investigators know this. They do not simply take every contradiction as proof of guilt. They test it, they return to it. They compare it against evidence that does not have memory, fear, or loyalty. That is why physical and digital evidence become so important. A person may forget. A person may minimize. A person may hide. A person may protect someone. But a timestamp does not feel guilt. A camera does not grieve. A phone record does not choose sides. A bloodstain does not care who is embarrassed, who is frightened, or who wants a story to go away. Evidence can be incomplete. Evidence can be misunderstood. Evidence can be challenged. But evidence, when gathered properly, gives investigators something stronger than rumor. It gives them a structure. And in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, that structure began forming around the home. The home was not just a backdrop. It was the beginning of the case. Every room could matter. Every entrance could matter. Every recording device could matter. Every sign of disturbance could matter. Investigators would have to determine whether someone had come prepared, whether someone had acted impulsively, whether someone had tried to clean up, whether someone had tried to disable evidence, whether the scene reflected panic, planning, or both. The public often wants to know what one clue solved the case. But real investigations rarely work that way. They are not solved by one clue. They are built by accumulation. One detail leans against another. One statement supports or contradicts another. One piece of digital evidence places pressure on a human explanation. One physical finding narrows the possible version of events. Over time, a story begins to take shape. In the beginning, though, there was no complete story. There was only Nancy's absence and the awful question of what happened to her. For the people who loved her, that question was not abstract. It was immediate and unbearable. When someone dies and the family knows what happened, grief has a terrible clarity. But when someone disappears, grief has no floor. It drops and drops. Every possibility remains alive. Every hope hurts. Every fear feels possible. You imagine them injured. You imagine them trapped. You imagine them calling for help. You imagine them already gone. You wake up into the same uncertainty every day. And when the missing person is elderly and medically vulnerable, the fear becomes even sharper. Time is not neutral. Time becomes an enemy. Every hour without medication, warmth, food, water, mobility assistance, or medical care increases the danger. Investigators knew that. The family knew that. The public, once the case spread, knew that too. But whoever knew what happened already had a head start. That is another brutal truth in disappearance cases. The person responsible, if someone is responsible, begins with an advantage. They know what happened before anyone else does. They know where the victim went. They know what evidence exists. They know what they touched, what they moved, what they forgot, and what they hope nobody finds. Investigators are always catching up to a reality the offender already knows. But that advantage does not last forever, because people make mistakes. They underestimate cameras. They underestimate digital records. They underestimate how much a home can remember. They underestimate how much family members notice. They underestimate how hard silence is to maintain when investigators keep asking the same questions in different ways. At first, the person responsible may believe the night belongs to them. They may believe that because the act happened in darkness, because the victim is gone, because the scene was quiet, because no one immediately stopped them, the truth can remain buried. But investigations are built to take darkness apart. They turn night into timestamps. They turn silence into phone records. They turn absence into search patterns. They turn blood into testing. They turn doorways into movement paths. They turn family memories into statements. They turn lies into pressure. And slowly, the hidden night begins to lose its privacy. In the days that followed Nancy's disappearance, the question of who had access to her became unavoidable, not because access proves guilt, but because access matters. Whoever came close to Nancy on that final night either had to overcome the barriers around her or already understand them. That includes physical barriers, like doors and cameras, but also emotional barriers, like trust. Would Nancy open the door? Would she resist? Would she recognize the person? Would she be confused? Would she believe she was safe because the person near her was familiar? Those questions are painful, but they are necessary. They force the investigation into the human reality of the case. Nancy was not just a location on a map. She was a person with relationships. To understand what happened to her, investigators had to understand those relationships. And that is where the story begins to darken in a different way. Because once investigators look closely at the people around a missing person, they often find tensions that were not visible to outsiders. Financial pressure, family disagreements, caregiving stress, arguments over property, conflicts over authority, resentments that had been buried for years, dependence, control, fear, secrets. Most of those things never lead to violence. But when violence does happen, those old tensions suddenly matter. In the script you gave me, there is a heavy focus on financial issues, power of attorney, a refused loan, digital concealment, and alleged statements about someone close to Nancy. Those elements create a powerful documentary direction, but they need to be introduced slowly, because Part 1 is not yet the place to declare what happened. Part 1 is the place to make the audience feel the mystery closing in. It is the place to establish Nancy's final known night, the broken routine, the home, the silence, and the fact that this was never a normal missing person case. The more complicated allegations can come later, after the audience understands why investigators would even begin looking beyond the obvious. Part 1 should leave the viewer with dread, not answers. It should make them understand that the case began with a woman missing from her own home, but almost immediately became something bigger, something that suggested planning, something that suggested knowledge, something that suggested whoever was involved may have understood Nancy's world from the inside. That inside knowledge is one of the most chilling possibilities in any case like this, because strangers are frightening, but betrayal is worse. A stranger attacks from outside your life. Betrayal uses the life you already built. It uses your routines, your trust, your kindness, your limitations, your open door, your belief that the people around you would not harm you. And when an elderly woman disappears from home, that possibility becomes impossible to ignore. Still, investigators could not begin with betrayal as a conclusion. They had to begin with facts. They had to treat every possible explanation with discipline. Was there evidence of forced entry? Was there evidence that Nancy left under her own power? Was there evidence of a vehicle? Was there evidence that someone tampered with cameras? Was there evidence that someone cleaned, moved, staged, or concealed something? Did neighbors report anything? Did anyone's timeline shift? Did anyone close to Nancy behave strangely before or after she vanished? The answers to those questions would not all come at once. Some would come from the house. Some would come from technology. Some would come from interviews. Some would come from silence. Because silence itself can become evidence when it does not belong. There is the silence of a missing phone, the silence of a person who should have called, the silence of a device that stopped recording, the silence of a family member who knows more than they first admit, the silence of a suspect who becomes careful too late, the silence between a disappearance and a 911 call, the silence of a home after something violent has happened inside it. In Nancy's case, the silence was everywhere. It was in the unanswered questions. It was in the missing hours. It was in the gap between the last normal moment and the first moment of panic. And that silence became the space investigators had to enter. For the viewer, this is the emotional engine of Part 1. They need to feel that they are standing at the edge of the case before the full picture has emerged. They need to feel the ordinary world becoming strange. They need to see Nancy not as a headline, but as a person whose life was interrupted. They need to understand why the home matters, why the timeline matters, why the first morning matters, why investigators would eventually begin asking harder and harder questions of the people around her. A strong documentary voiceover does not rush to the twist. It lets the fear build. It lets the audience sit with the facts long enough to understand their weight. And the weight here is simple and devastating. Nancy Guthrie came home. By morning, she was gone. The house did not explain it. Her belongings did not explain it. Her routine did not explain it. and the people who loved her were left staring at a reality that made no sense. That is the point where law enforcement enters not just as a search effort, but as a force of reconstruction. They have to rebuild the night from whatever survived it. They have to collect what the offender may have missed. They have to listen to what the family says and what the evidence says, and they have to notice when those two things do not match. The first stage of the investigation likely involved the kind of careful work that the public rarely sees in full. Crime scene technicians documenting the home, detectives separating witnesses, officers canvassing the neighborhood, investigators asking for security footage from surrounding homes, analysts checking whether any unusual vehicles appeared in the area, family members being interviewed again and again, not necessarily because they are accused, but because their memories may hold details they do not yet realize are important. A person may remember a comment days later. They may remember someone's mood. They may remember who asked about Nancy's schedule. They may remember a vehicle they dismissed at the time. They may remember an argument. They may remember a silence. And sometimes, one remembered detail becomes the thread that starts pulling the case apart. But in the beginning, everything is fragile. The family is fragile. The evidence is fragile. The timeline is fragile. The public understanding is fragile. That is why investigators are careful about what they release. They may know more than they say. They may hold back details only the offender would know. They may allow the public to believe the case is moving slowly, while behind the scenes they are building pressure on a person or group of people. They may interview someone, not because they need the answer to the question they are asking, but because they already know the answer and want to see whether the person will lie. That is another thing viewers should understand. An interrogation or interview is not always about learning something new. Sometimes it is about testing what investigators already know. A detective may ask where someone was at a certain time because phone data already suggests the answer. They may ask about a call because records already show it happened. They may ask whether someone saw Nancy because footage already places them near her. They may ask about a relationship because another witness has already described the tension. And when someone lies about a detail investigators can prove, the lie becomes part of the evidence. Not proof of the entire crime, but proof of consciousness, proof that something is being hidden, proof that the person understands the truth may hurt them. That is why the first version of everyone's story matters. Not because memory must be perfect, but because lies have a different texture. They often avoid specifics. They shift when evidence appears. They explain too much in one place and not enough in another. They become rehearsed. They become defensive. They bend around facts instead of meeting them directly. In Nancy's case, as the investigation deepened, the public would hear more and more about possible evidence, possible digital trails, possible family statements, and possible people of interest. But the foundation remained the same. The home, the night, the disappearance. Everything else grew from there. If this were a fictional story, the first episode might end with a shocking revelation. But real cases do not owe the audience that kind of rhythm. The real shock is often quieter. It is the realization that there may have been warning signs before anyone understood them. That a person can be surrounded by people and still be vulnerable. That danger can come wearing a familiar face. That a peaceful neighborhood can become the setting for a violent mystery. That a family can wake up one morning and discover that life has split into before and after. Before Nancy disappeared. After Nancy disappeared. And after is where the questions live. Who knew she was home that night? Who was the last person to see her safe? Who had reason to be near her property? Who understood her physical limitations? Who knew whether she would answer the door? Who knew where cameras were located? Who had something to gain? Who had something to hide? Who seemed afraid after the fact? Who stayed too quiet? Who talked too much? Who tried to control the story before the story was even known? These questions do not accuse by themselves, but they are the beginning of the road investigators had to travel. And once they started down that road, There was no easy way back, because every answer created another question. Every piece of evidence narrowed the path. Every interview added pressure. And somewhere, beyond the public statements and the search snippets, someone knew more than they were saying. That possibility hangs over the entire first part of this documentary, not as a conclusion, as a shadow. A shadow over the doorway, a shadow over the timeline, a shadow over the people closest to Nancy, a shadow over the hours between the night she came home and the morning she was gone. Because whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a specific place at a specific time, under specific conditions. It required opportunity. It created evidence. It left consequences. It changed the behavior of the people around it. And no matter how carefully someone may have tried to hide the truth had already begun leaving traces. That is the hope in cases like this, not hope in the easy sense. Not hope that everything will be fixed because Nancy was still missing, and her family was living through a nightmare no family should have to endure. But hope in the investigative sense. Hope that the night was not as silent as the offender believed. Hope that the house remembered something. Hope that the cameras saw something. Hope that the evidence survived. Hope that someone close to the truth would eventually speak. Hope that the person who thought they had removed Nancy from the world had not removed the proof of what they did. Because disappearance is often an attempt to erase a person, to erase a crime, to erase responsibility, to erase the moment when one human being chose to harm another. But investigations are acts of recovery. They recover footage. They recover blood evidence. They recover deleted records. They recover memories. They recover the shape of a night someone wanted to bury. And most importantly, they recover the identity of the person at the center of it all. Nancy Guthrie was not just missing. She was taken from the life she knew. And even before the case had answers, even before the public understood the full direction of the investigation, the early facts carried a terrible message. This was not random confusion. This was not a simple absence. This was not a woman who quietly walked away from everything. Something happened. Someone knew. And the house on that quiet Catalina foothills night had become the beginning of a much larger truth. That is where part 1 leaves us. At the edge of Nancy's home, staring into the hours no one could fully explain yet. The front door has become more than a door. The morning silence has become more than concern. The missing belongings, the broken routine, the sudden fear, and the involvement of investigators have all begun forming the outline of a case that would only grow darker as more details emerged. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance began with one unanswered question. Where is Nancy? But as investigators looked closer, that question started to change. Because the evidence did not only ask where she went, it asked who had been close enough to make her vanish. And in part 2, the focus moves directly to the evidence at the home, the doorway, the cameras, the signs of violence. The timeline investigators began building, and the chilling possibility that whoever came for Nancy may have known exactly how to get inside her world. By the time investigators began looking closely at Nancy Guthrie's home, the question had already moved beyond simple concern. This was no longer just a family trying to reach an elderly woman who had missed a morning obligation. This was no longer just a welfare check, or a confusing absence, or the kind of situation where everyone hoped there had been a misunderstanding. The home itself was beginning to speak, and what it appeared to say was deeply disturbing. There are cases where a missing person's residence offers almost nothing. No signs of struggle, no broken routine, no physical indication that anything violent occurred, no clue pointing toward whether the person left voluntarily, wandered away, or was taken. In those cases, investigators are forced to build outward from uncertainty. But Nancy's home was different. It was not just the place where she had last been known to be. It became the place where the first real answers seemed to be hiding. The entrance mattered. The cameras mattered. The timing mattered. The condition of the property mattered. The things left behind mattered. And most of all, the signs near the threshold of the home seemed to shift the case into a darker category. Because When an elderly woman disappears from the place where she should have been safest, investigators do not only ask where she went. They ask how she left. They ask whether she walked out, whether she was helped out, whether she was forced out, whether she was carried out, whether someone staged the scene to make one version of events look more believable than another. And every one of those possibilities begins at the same place, the door. A door can be ordinary for years. It can open for family, friends, neighbors, deliveries, church members, caregivers, and people the homeowner trusts. It can be passed through thousands of times without anyone thinking about it. But in an investigation, that same door becomes a witness. It becomes the boundary between Nancy's final known safety and whatever happened next. That is why investigators would have looked at it with such care. Was there damage? Was there blood? Was there movement captured nearby? Was anything missing? Was anything cleaned? Was the area disturbed? Was there evidence that Nancy had tried to resist? Was there evidence that someone had tried to control what the cameras would see? In the public imagination, an abduction often looks loud, violent, chaotic, obvious. A scream in the night, a broken window, a neighbor calling police immediately, a car speeding away. But many real crimes are quieter than people want to believe. Sometimes the most frightening violence does not announce itself to the neighborhood. Sometimes it happens quickly. Sometimes it happens inside a home where walls contain the sound. Sometimes it happens because the victim trusts the person at the door long enough to let the danger come close. That possibility is what makes Nancy Guthrie's disappearance so chilling. Because if someone came to her home that night, and if that person knew enough to reach her at the right moment, then this may not have been random. It may not have been a stranger stumbling upon an opportunity. It may have been someone who understood her world, someone who knew when she would be home, someone who knew she was vulnerable, someone who knew the property, someone who believed they could get close enough, and someone who may have believed the evidence could be controlled. But evidence is rarely as obedient as the person committing the crime wants it to be. A house remembers things in ways people do not expect. It remembers through marks, stains, movement, timestamps, open doors, closed doors, broken patterns, missing objects, and tiny details that seem meaningless until trained investigators begin connecting them. A house remembers where someone stood. It remembers what someone touched. It remembers what was moved. It remembers what was left behind. It remembers the difference between ordinary activity and sudden disruption. And Nancy's house, quiet as it may have looked from the outside, may have been holding the first pieces of the truth. The front entrance became one of the emotional centers of the case because it represented the moment where Nancy's normal life may have been breached. It is difficult not to imagine that moment. An elderly woman returning home, perhaps tired, perhaps relieved to be back, perhaps thinking about the next morning, perhaps unaware that someone else may have been thinking about her movements in a very different way. That is one of the painful realities of victim-centered cases. While Nancy may have been living an ordinary evening, someone else may have been planning around it. That does not mean investigators could assume premeditation from the start. They could not. They had to follow the evidence. But the possibility of planning becomes unavoidable when the scene suggests that the person responsible knew too much, knew the location, knew the timing, knew the vulnerability, knew the access points, knew where to move and when to disappear. And that brings us to one of the most important questions in the early investigation. What did the cameras see? In modern disappearance cases, cameras are often the silent witnesses everyone turns to first. Doorbell cameras, security systems, neighboring homes, traffic cameras, storefronts, gas stations, street footage, private surveillance. Every image can become part of the timeline. Every second can matter. But cameras do not always give easy answers. Sometimes they capture too little. Sometimes they capture just enough to haunt everyone. Sometimes the angle is wrong. Sometimes the lighting is poor. Sometimes the person is partially hidden. Sometimes the camera stops recording at the exact moment investigators most need it. And sometimes the absence of footage becomes almost as important as footage itself. A missing recording can be a technical failure, a dead battery, a Wi-Fi issue, a storage problem, a system glitch. But when a recording disappears at a critical time, investigators have to ask whether it was truly accidental. They have to examine whether the camera was disabled, blocked, moved, unplugged, reset, or manipulated by someone who understood what it might capture. Because in a case like Nancy's, control of visibility matters. Whoever came to that home, if someone did, may have known that cameras were present. They may have known where they were. They may have known what could be seen and what could not. They may have tried to move through blind spots. They may have relied on darkness. They may have believed that a brief appearance would not be enough to identify them. But modern investigations do not always require a perfect image. They work with patterns. A figure walking at a certain time, a shadow crossing a driveway, a vehicle arriving without a clear reason, a phone connecting nearby, a light turning on, a door opening, a camera detecting motion, a gap in footage that lines up too perfectly with other evidence. One image alone may not explain a crime, but when it is placed beside blood evidence, witness statements, device data, and the victim's last known movements, it can become powerful. And in Nancy's case, the home's visual record appears to have been one of the central areas investigators had to understand. The disturbing thing about camera evidence is that it often gives the public a false sense of certainty. People think if there was a camera, then surely the truth must be obvious. Surely there must be a face, a plate number, a clear frame, a definitive answer. But that is not always how it works. Sometimes a camera does not solve the mystery. Sometimes it deepens it. It shows a person but not clearly enough. It shows movement but not intention. It shows arrival but not what happened inside. It shows that someone was there but not why. It shows a gap but not who created it. And then investigators are left with a more difficult task. They must turn visual fragments into a timeline strong enough to support the larger case. That timeline would have been critical from the first day. Nancy's final known evening had to be reconstructed. Her return home had to be placed accurately. The last confirmed moment of safety had to be established. Then investigators had to work forward through the night, identifying every known event and every unexplained silence. The moment she arrived, the condition of the home afterward, the first missed contact, the first concern, the first person to check on her, the first call for help, the first officer on scene, the first evidence recognized as suspicious. Every point mattered, and every person connected to those points mattered too. Because when a vulnerable person disappears from a residence, the investigation naturally begins dividing people into categories. People who saw her before, people who expected to see her after, people who had access, people who had information, people who had reason to know her movements, people who appeared in the timeline, people whose statements matched the evidence, people whose statements did not. This is not accusation, it is process. But process can feel brutal when the missing person is someone loved. Family members may feel watched. Friends may feel questioned. Neighbors may feel suspicious of one another. Rumors begin to move faster than facts. The public begins forming theories. People search social media. They look for old photos, old conflicts, old comments, old financial issues, old wounds. Everyone wants to believe they can see the answer before the investigators reveal it. But an investigation cannot be built on the public's hunger for certainty. It has to be built on evidence. And that evidence, in Nancy's case, seemed to pull attention back to the house again and again. The doorway, the signs of violence, the possibility of camera interference, the timeline, the route someone may have taken, the way Nancy could have been removed, the question of whether the person responsible knew how to avoid being seen. There is something terrifying about the idea of a home invasion. But there is something even more terrifying about a home invasion that may not have looked like one at first. A violent stranger breaking in is one kind of nightmare. But someone entering because they were trusted, expected, or familiar is another kind entirely. That is the kind of possibility investigators have to examine without emotion. Would Nancy have opened the door to this person? Would she have allowed them inside? Would they have known how to speak to her? Would they have known what made her feel safe? Would they have known when she would be alone? Would they have known that time was limited before someone noticed she was missing? These questions create the bridge between the physical evidence and the human circle art around Nancy. A crime scene can tell investigators that something happened, but relationships can help explain how it was possible. This is why part 2 of Nancy's story cannot only be about blood and cameras. It has to be about access, because access is the invisible evidence in many cases. It does not always leave fingerprints. It does not always appear in a photograph. It does not always show up as a broken lock or forced window. Sometimes access is emotional. Sometimes access is relational. Sometimes access is built over years. Someone knows the victim. Someone knows the routine. Someone knows the property. Someone knows the medical needs. Someone knows the fear, the trust, the habits, the schedule, the weaknesses. And if that person turns predatory, the victim may never see the danger in time. That is why investigators often look closely at the people who knew the victim best. Not because loved ones are automatically guilty. Most are not. Most are devastated. Most want answers. But the people closest to a victim are also the people who can tell investigators what outsiders cannot. Who had recently changed? Who had been angry? Who was asking about money? Who had been around the house? Who knew about security systems? Who had made Nancy uncomfortable? Who did Nancy trust even when others had concerns? Who seemed unusually calm after she vanished? Who wanted to speak for the family? Who avoided speaking at all? Those questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Because the evidence at the home did not exist in isolation. It existed inside Nancy's life. Every mark at the entrance had a human explanation behind it. Every gap in footage had a reason. Every movement had a body behind it. Every decision made that night belonged to someone. The job of investigators was to identify that someone, and the house was only the beginning. As the forensic work continued, investigators would have needed to determine exactly what physical evidence had been left behind. If blood was found near the entrance, they would need to know whose blood it was, how much was present, what pattern it made, whether it suggested injury, movement, contact, or cleanup. Blood evidence is not just a sign that something violent may have happened. It can also tell a story about direction and action. A drop can suggest one thing. A smear can suggest another. A transfer stain can suggest contact. A pool can suggest time. A trail can suggest movement. A cleaned area can suggest consciousness. And if blood is found in a location where it does not belong, the location becomes part of the narrative. Near a front entrance, it raises immediate questions. Was Nancy injured there? Was someone else injured there? Was there a struggle at the doorway? Was she attacked as she entered? Was she pulled from the home? Was the injury caused inside and transferred outward? Did the person responsible attempt to clean or conceal it? Again, no single answer can be assumed, but the questions themselves show why investigators would take the scene so seriously. Blood changes a missing person case. It shifts the emotional and legal weight. It suggests that the disappearance may not be about confusion or wandering. It suggests harm. It suggests force. It suggests that whatever happened to Nancy was not peaceful, not voluntary, and not easily explained away. For a family, learning that kind of detail is devastating, because until violence is suggested, there is still room, however small, for softer explanations. Maybe she is lost. Maybe someone took her, but she is alive. Maybe there has been a misunderstanding. Maybe she will be found confused but safe. But when physical evidence suggests injury, hope becomes more complicated. It does not disappear. Families rarely let hope go completely, but it becomes heavier. It begins to carry dread. Investigators understand this, but they cannot let emotion distort their work. They have to document everything. Photograph everything, collect everything, preserve everything. They have to think not only about finding Nancy, but about proving what happened to her if the case reaches court. That means every piece of evidence has to survive scrutiny. Defense attorneys will question contamination. They will question interpretation. They will question collection methods. They will question whether the evidence truly points where prosecutors say it points. That is why crime scene work is slow. It is careful, it is repetitive, it has to be. Because the truth is not enough if it cannot be proven. And in Nancy's case, the home likely became a place of painstaking examination. Every visible sign, every hidden trace, every possible point of entry, every possible path of movement, every item that seemed out of place, every surface someone may have touched, every camera system, every digital device, every possible trace of whoever was there. But the person responsible may have believed they had time. That belief is common in crimes committed in private places. The offender may think privacy protects them. They may think the victim's vulnerability protects them. They may think darkness protects them. They may think family confusion protects them. They may think if the body is not immediately found, the case becomes too difficult to prove. But that is a dangerous misunderstanding, because the absence of a body does not mean the absence of evidence. A disappearance can still leave behind an enormous forensic trail. The home can show violence. The devices can show movement. The cameras can show arrival or departure. The phone records can show proximity. The financial records can show pressure. The interviews can show motive. The deleted messages can show consciousness. The timeline can show opportunity. And when those pieces begin aligning, the missing person's silence does not end the investigation. It drives it. This is where the case begins to become more than a search. It becomes a reconstruction of intent. Investigators are not only asking what happened to Nancy. They are asking whether someone planned it, whether someone concealed it, whether someone acted alone, whether someone had help, whether someone tried to manipulate the investigation afterward, whether someone used grief as a cover. That last possibility is especially painful. In cases involving people close to the victim, the public often struggles with the idea that someone could appear concerned while hiding involvement. But history has shown that offenders sometimes insert themselves into searches, speak to investigators, comfort family members, attend vigils, make public statements, or act devastated while privately knowing the truth. This does not mean every grieving person is suspicious. It means investigators have to separate authentic grief from performance. That is not easy. Human emotion is complicated. People grieve strangely. Some cry, some go numb, some organize. Some avoid cameras, some speak too much, some speak too little. None of that alone proves anything. But behavior becomes relevant when it conflicts with evidence. If someone says they were nowhere near the home, but data places them there, that matters. If someone says they did not know Nancy's schedule, but witnesses say they did, that matters. If someone says they were worried immediately, but records show a long delay, that matters. If someone says they had no reason to hide communications, but messages were deleted during a critical period, that matters. If someone says they barely knew the property, but evidence suggests familiarity, that matters. This is how an investigation begins to tighten. Not with one dramatic accusation, but with pressure applied to inconsistencies. And the evidence at Nancy's home would have been the first source of that pressure. The house asked questions that people had to answer. The cameras asked questions. The blood asked questions. The timeline asked questions. And the longer those questions remained unanswered, the more suspicious the silence became. At the center of all of this was the painful reality that Nancy herself could not explain what happened. She could not tell investigators who came to the door. She could not describe whether she was afraid. She could not say whether she recognized the person. She could not say whether she tried to fight back. She could not say where she was taken. So investigators had to make the evidence speak for her. That is the moral force behind cases like this. Evidence is not just technical. It is not just laboratory work. It is a way of giving the victim back a voice. A blood pattern can say, "Something happened here." A camera can say, "Someone came here." A phone record can say, "Someone was nearby." A deleted message can say, "Someone tried to hide this." A witness can say, "I saw something." A timeline can say, "This story does not fit." Piece by piece, the silence starts to break. But in part 2, the silence is still powerful. It still surrounds the house. It still surrounds the missing hours. It still surrounds the person who may have approached Nancy's door and left with her life changed forever. The disturbing possibility is that the offender may have understood the first stage of the crime better than the investigators did. They may have known how Nancy was removed. They may have known what evidence was left. They may have known what story they planned to tell, if questioned. They may have known which relationships could be used to confuse the truth. But what they may not have understood was how much modern evidence can survive. Digital systems are difficult to fully erase. Cameras may store data in multiple places. Phones may create location trails even when users think they are invisible. Vehicles may trigger license plate readers or neighborhood cameras. Messages may be deleted on a device but preserved elsewhere. Cloud systems may retain logs. Metadata may show when files were created, modified, transferred, or destroyed. And physical evidence can be even more stubborn. Blood can remain after cleaning. Touch DNA can linger. Fibers can transfer. Footwear impressions can survive. Soil can cling to tires. A small mark can reveal direction. A missing object can reveal intention. Offenders often imagine the crime only from their own point of view. They focus on the big things. Avoid being seen. Move quickly. Leave no obvious weapon. Control the victim. Get away. But investigations live in the small things. They live in the trace, the overlooked, the almost invisible. The tiny mistake made because panic entered the plan. The offender may have thought the house was quiet, but the house was collecting evidence. As investigators continued processing Nancy's home, they would have had to separate what was normal from what was not. That is harder than it sounds. A lived-in home is full of personal disorder. Items are moved for ordinary reasons. Doors are left open. Surfaces are touched. Clothing is placed somewhere and forgotten. A glass is left out. A rug shifts. A drawer remains open. The challenge is identifying which details belong to daily life and which belong to the event. Family members and people close to Nancy become important for that reason too. They can tell investigators what looks wrong. They can explain routines. They can say where things usually were. They can help identify missing items. They can help determine whether something was disturbed. But their knowledge also exposes them to scrutiny, because the person who can best explain what is unusual may also be someone who had enough familiarity to create the scene. That dual role is one of the most difficult aspects of inner circle investigations. The people who help may also have to be examined. The people grieving may also hold information. The people who know the victim best may have the clearest memories and the most complicated motives. Investigators cannot assume innocence because someone is close. They also cannot assume guilt because someone is close. They have to let the evidence decide. And in Nancy's case, the evidence seemed to be leading in a direction that was not random. At least that is the sense created by the early focus on the home, the entrance, the camera systems, and the later allegations surrounding digital activity and family knowledge in the material you provided. The story was becoming layered. Physical evidence at the scene. A timeline that needed explanation. People close to Nancy who may have known more than they initially said. Digital questions that would later become important.